This is TWiT.
We don't want to give short shrift to the other product Apple shipped a couple of weeks ago, a new iPad Air. Any of you have the new iPad Air?
Yep.
Yep.
Nope.
Yep.
Lory? Yep.
Sorry, it's inside the Magic Keyboard because it also fits with the Magic Keyboard.
So this is kind of a little bit like a Pro, but not quite. It's got the square sides. It's got the USB-C port. It's the only iPad with Touch ID and the power button because there's no more home button.
This is actually very.
Does it work?
It's not only does it work, it works really fast, like it would on your phone with Touch ID. The button, I expected it to, always kind of take a second, because if you remember back when Touch ID first came to iPhone, it was a little slow. You kind of held your finger down for about a half a second before it would trigger. And I've been really, really happy with the experience on the iPad Air. You barely lightly rest your finger. It catches it right away, opens up, unlocks right away. Going from iPad Pro to iPad Air, the only thing that's awkward is that I'm now used to my face unlocking the iPad. So it's a little like physical movement that isn't as convenient as it used to be. But most people are not going to go from an iPad Pro to an iPad Air, so that's not even going to be an issue for a lot of people.
Is this going to be the default iPad? Like when people ask me about iPads, I say, hey, look, with $329, the base model is so affordable, there's no reason to buy an Android device. I like my iPad Pro, but it's as expensive as a laptop. This is kind of in the middle. Is this, you think, the one that most people will get, Lory?
What I really think is yes. And because what I really think Apple is going to do is turn the iPad Pro into a really pro machine with those sort of extra bumps and extra sensors and extra features that most people don't need. So the iPad Air, like previously, you either went with what you could afford or you bought an iPad Pro. Nobody bought an iPad Air. It was
now
really
this
just
is kind of the affordable iPad Pro, right? This is kind of in that space.
Exactly. Yeah. This is going to be the one that everybody's going to want. I can't even tell the difference day to day between this and my 2018 iPad Pro. I can't tell at all. Like, I could pick them both up. I mean, literally, they're in the same case. I could pick them both up and not know the difference between them day to day with regular use.
Do you see any speed difference?
It's definitely
theoretically
the iPad everyone wants.
The Air has the new, a faster version of the A14, right? But do you see, does it feel different? I think the iPads are so fast.
For some reason.
Uh-oh.
So I can't hear you.
The iPad Air it's faster for single-threaded operations, so the UI, everything like that, feels just super snappy. The areas where it's different is that the memory bandwidth isn't as big. It's got multiple cores. It's like 2 extra CPU cores, 4 extra GPU cores, and it'll go to 1 terabyte. So, and it's also got 6 gigabytes of RAM. So just keeping apps in memory and the amount of memory those apps can access. But you're talking about real, like you're using video editing, a ton of photographic editing, petapixel images, that sort of thing is where you'll notice the difference. Yeah. Not really consumery stuff.
In The Verge, Dieter Bohn says the $599 iPad Air is the best tablet for most people. And in Gadget, Dana Woolman says, with so few differences between the iPad Air and the Pro, I'm forced to reconsider who the Air is for. Interesting.
It's just a little bit low on storage for the $599. Like, because
it's only 64 gigs
more than it was. Yeah. And it's 64 gigs, which if you live that streaming life, if you're all about the Netflix and the Spotify and all that kind of stuff, and you keep everything in the cloud, that's fine. I know a lot of people who don't hit 64 gigs, but for me, I still like a lot of local stuff. So I would splurge on the update. And unlike the iPhone, it's not $50 more, it's $100 more for 128. So that, to me, it increases the cost of entry a little bit.
Did Apple, with its pricing, muddy the waters a little bit? Because you're starting to nudge the iPad Pro comparably equipped.
The iPad Pro goes to 12.9, which to me is like everything else aside, like all the chipset and memory and storage differences aside, you can't get a bigger iPad Air. Right. So and I think if at a certain point, like especially if it's your laptop replacement, the 12.9 is just in a category of its own.
I am fond of the 12.9, I must say.
Yeah. It's a tough call. I think you have a point that Apple's kind of blurred the lines between I think these two categories of devices, because I still have and still use my my 12.9 first generation iPad Pro. There's something about the size of that screen as a handheld screen, multi-touch, whether I'm reading comics, whether I'm trying to multitask, anything of that nature. However, once we're in the category of spending $1,000 and up, what is the best way to solve a certain problem with fill a certain gap in your computing arsenal with $1,000 plus? And once you start opening up your thinking that way, you start to bring in, well, how about a machine that could not just run a special coming attractions version of mobile Photoshop, but can actually run the entire creative suite. Certainly not with the same amount of horsepower that you'll get with the modern Apple Silicon, but still it might be a more practical solution for a lot of people. This is why I do think the iPad Air is a wonderful step forward, because to me it really is in the sweet spot of a value computer and also a valuable computer that takes advantage of being a tablet while not losing sight of having to be a productivity machine as well. I think that when you walk into an Apple store wanting an iPad, that really is the default choice. And if someone says that, if you're talking to the customer and you find out that they actually just want it for occasional use, you want to downgrade them into the $329 entry level iPad, and it's hard to have I think it's a much longer conversation to talk someone up into the iPad Pro at this point.
You can only use the Magic Keyboard though with this new iPad Air and the iPad Pros. That's a pretty big selling point. Did you get the Magic Keyboard, Lory?
Yeah. In fact, you don't need a different Magic Keyboard either. It's the
same
you
as
can
the
use
11.
the exact same one, right? It works with both. So it's the exact same case as the iPad Pro from 2018 on. So any case that you have for your iPad Pro also works with the iPad Air, which, by the way, again, nobody's going to go from an iPad Pro to an iPad Air. So that's not really a discussion to be having, unless for some strange reason you decide that you want to sell your iPad Pro because you don't need it, and you'll use the money that you save to buy your iPad Air.
But you shouldn't be seduced by the A14.
Absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, it's great and it works fast. But for me, just like I said, like I don't really see just the day-to-day use that I have for it. I don't see a difference in performance. I don't see a difference in battery life, in screen. I mean, I know like there is
theoretically a difference.
Screen
yeah.
Yes, exactly. But for like someone like me on day-to-day usage, the way I use it, there isn't a difference. So there literally is, but just for like my personal views, I would say anybody who used to want an iPad Air or an iPad Pro because they didn't think the iPad Air was quite good enough, that's really not the case right now. And I also think that the iPad Pro is going to be a huge upgrade very soon, probably March, not for sure. But I think that Apple's not just going to sit on an iPad Pro that is, with an iPad Air that's almost as good. They're going to bump that up.
It feels to me like they shouldn't have these in stagger step releases. They should do all the iPads at once. Then you can make a logical choice. Now,
mini LED's not ready yet.
Is that the reason?
The screens. Yeah, the new iPad Pros are supposed to have the mini LEDs, and they're not in production yet. So I think if they'd had their druthers, if 2020 had been a very different year, I think we would have seen everything released in a very different schedule. But so many of the things just didn't time out right, and I think that's one of the big ones.
I have to wonder if they're doing an A/B comparison too between Face ID and Touch ID to see, because they didn't put Touch ID on the new iPhones. They only put it on this Air.
See, that's a problem with their culture. It's like they prepare these devices so far ahead, and that sacrifices a bit of agility in order for them to be able to do the level of integration they do across departments. And they didn't foresee the pandemic, so they'd had this iPhone was ready and going into production last spring already. And the rumor is we're going to be getting in-display fingerprints next year, but they can't rush that a year forward. Where with the iPad Air, it's just, we can save $100 off the bill of goods if we don't put a true depth camera system in there. We have this Touch ID thing, so wouldn't it be great if we just put it in the power
actually
button?
prefer Touch ID. I'd rather see that everywhere, but that's just me maybe.
The only down point for me, like where I notice it, is that when it's sitting in the Magic Keyboard, like in my hands, it's fine because I registered both of my index fingers. So whether it's here in landscape or here in portrait, it's super easy. But when it's on the Magic Keyboard with Face ID, you press a key on that keyboard and it just opens because it's staring right at you. Where with Touch ID, you've got to stop first. You got to go press. I'm not going to say like an animal. You have to reach up and do like a physical act again, like it's 2018 or whatever.
It's a little bit of a trip up, which is funny with when I switched over to the iPhone SE from an iPhone 11 Pro. So I was going from Face ID to Touch ID. That was seamless. It didn't even matter. It was fine. I wasn't distracted by the extra step having to use my thumb or anything like that. But for the iPad, going from iPad Pro to iPad Air, that is a little like just a tiny little stutter of that's right. I got to reach out and do it. Yeah. So it's a little tiny bit of a difference.